A routine encounter, or so they thought. The Velthar Dominion was no stranger to war. Their fleet had conquered hundreds of systems, crushed civilizations, and left countless species kneeling before their might. To them, humans were just another species waiting to be subdued. Their ships were small, their numbers were few, and their experience in space combat was laughable compared to the centuries of Velthar warfare. So when Admiral Krail Vex received a report of a lone human warship drifting near the contested border of Dominion space, he barely paid it any attention. A single human vessel was no threat to the Velthar armada. It was routine, nothing more than a formality to eliminate any resistance. The fleet of the Velthar Dominion arrived in formation, their warships blotting out the stars as they surrounded the human vessel. It was an older design, nothing special, nothing that should have survived in deep space alone. The Velthar officers aboard the command bridge chuckled among themselves. This was going to be an easy victory. Admiral Krail Vex sat in his throne-like command chair, his scaled fingers tapping against the armrest. He studied the view screen, his golden eyes narrowing at the human ship. It wasn't moving, not running, not even attempting to hail them. Just sitting there, waiting. "How foolish," muttered one of his officers. "Do they think surrender will save them?" Krail Vex sneered. "It will not." He leaned forward and opened a direct communication line. His voice echoed through the void. "Human vessel, this is Admiral Krail Vex of the Velthar Dominion. Your presence in our space is a violation of interstellar law. You will power down your systems and prepare for immediate boarding." For a few moments, there was only silence. Then the screen flickered to life, and the human captain appeared. He was young, far younger than Krail Vex expected. His uniform was crisp, but his posture was relaxed, almost casual. Most species, when facing the full might of the Velthar fleet, trembled with fear. Some begged, others tried to negotiate for their lives. This human did none of those things. Instead, he smirked. The officers on the Velthar bridge exchanged confused glances. Krail Vex felt a slight chill run down his spine, though he quickly buried it beneath his pride. "Apologies, Admiral," the human said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I was just waiting to see how long it would take for you to start threatening me. Pretty predictable, to be honest." Krail Vex's patience thinned. "You misunderstand your situation, human. You are alone. We have you surrounded. Surrender now, and perhaps I will grant you a quick death." The human chuckled. It was an infuriating sound, one that made Krail Vex's blood boil. "You think I'm alone?" the human asked, tilting his head slightly. The Velthar admiral sneered. "What else could you possibly be?" The human's smirk widened. "Wrong question, Admiral. You should be asking, why am I smiling?" A moment of silence hung in the air. Then, a bright flash exploded across the darkness of space. Suddenly, the sensors aboard the Velthar flagship screamed with alarms. Readings spiked, warning lights flashed red, and the officers scrambled to their consoles, their faces draining of color. "Admiral," one of the officers gasped. "Multiple energy signatures detected." There. Before he could finish, the view screen changed, revealing the impossible. All around them, the empty void of space shimmered and distorted. Dozens, no, hundreds, of human warships decloaked from the darkness, their weapons already primed and locked onto the Velthar fleet. The lone human vessel had never been alone at all. It had been bait. A trap. And Krail Vex had walked right into it. His throat tightened as he turned back to the view screen. The human captain was still there, still smirking. But now his eyes were different. They weren't amused anymore. They were cold, calculating. "Admiral," the human said, his voice now devoid of humor, "you fired first. That was your last mistake." Then the human ships opened fire, and the battle began. The first blast hit the Velthar fleet like a thunderclap. The massive energy burst tore through one of the smallest Velthar destroyers, ripping it apart in an instant. The explosion sent a shockwave through space, sending debris scattering across the battlefield. Admiral Kralvex's eyes widened in disbelief as his fleet reeled from the sudden attack. How is this possible?" he growled, slamming his fists onto the armrests of his chair. He had seen human technology before, but nothing on this scale, nothing that could match the firepower of the Velfar Dominion. Another burst of energy hit one of the larger Velfar warships, this time causing the entire ship to shudder. The shields flared up briefly before failing, and the ship began to break apart under the weight of the assault. The human ships, with their sleek designs and unfamiliar weapons, were far stronger than Kralvex had ever expected. His fleet, once the undisputed rulers of this sector, was now being torn apart by a group of humans he had thought were weak and insignificant. "We've underestimated them," one of the officers on the command deck whispered, eyes wide with panic. "These humans, their technology, their tactics, they are not what we thought." Kralvex clenched his teeth in frustration. "What are they?" he hissed, his voice full of anger and disbelief. He had always believed that the Velfar's strength would be enough to crush anything in their path. Yet here he was, facing a situation that threatened to unravel everything his empire had built. On the view screen, the human fleet moved with precision. Each ship appeared to be in perfect coordination, executing maneuvers that the Velfar fleet could not hope to match. The humans weren't just attacking. They were outthinking them, anticipating their moves before they even made them. Kralvex could see it in the way the human ships moved, as if they were a single organism instead of dozens of individual vessels. "Report. What are their weaknesses?" Kralvex demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. They're not like us, Admiral," another officer stammered. "They don't have the same vulnerabilities as other species. Their shields are different, stronger, and their weapons, they're designed to bypass our defenses. We can't counter them. We're too slow." The realization hit Kralvex like a punch to the gut. These humans had done something no other species had ever managed. They had learned to fight the Velfar on their own terms. They didn't fear the Dominion. They didn't even seem to respect it. They were playing a different game, one that Kralvex didn't know how to win. Suddenly, the human ship surged forward, closing the gap between the two fleets at a speed that seemed impossible. The Velfar fleet, already thrown into disarray, was now completely off balance. The humans' advanced weaponry ripped through their lines, cutting through their ships like paper. The lights on the Velfar command deck flickered as explosions rocked the flagship. Kralvex's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. His fleet was being obliterated, his ships falling one by one, and he could see no way to stop the onslaught. Every time he thought they might have a chance to regroup, the human fleet outflanked them, trapping them in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Then a voice on the bridge broke through his thoughts. "Admiral, the human flagship is approaching. It's targeting us directly," the officer shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Kralvex's heart pounded. The human captain had been playing with them this entire time, luring them deeper into the trap. Now, the final blow was coming. The Velfar admiral turned to the view screen, staring as the human flagship advanced, its weapons glowing ominously. A strange calm washed over him, but it was not the calm of victory. It was the calm of a predator closing in for the kill. He had made a terrible mistake. The human fleet had made sure the Velfar fleet was too distracted, too fragmented to organize a defense. Now, it was just a matter of finishing the job. The flagship fired its main guns. A single blast of energy ripped through the vastness of space and struck the Velfar flagship's central core. The impact sent a violent shockwave through the ship, and alarms blared as the shields flickered and failed. The power systems went dark, and the ship began to slowly drift, crippled and dying. Kralvex stood, his fists clenched in anger. His voice, usually commanding and filled with authority, was now a low guttural growl. We are losing," he whispered. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like 1,000 tons. The Velfar Dominion, his empire, was crumbling before his very eyes, and all because of one human captain's smile. As the flagship began to disintegrate, Kralvex realized the truth. This wasn't just a battle. This was the end of an era. The Velfar were no longer the most feared force in the galaxy. In the blink of an eye, their empire had been dismantled by a species they had dismissed as insignificant. The human fleet, with its cold precision and ruthless tactics, was proving one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. Humans were not to be underestimated. And now, it was their turn to conquer the galaxy. The Velfar flagship was burning. Admiral Kralvex gritted his teeth, watching the destruction unfold before his eyes. Fires raged through the corridors. Emergency lights flickered, and the once mighty warship now drifted helplessly in the void. His fleet, the pride of the Velfar Dominion, was being torn apart. The humans were not just winning. They were dismantling his forces, ship by ship, with a precision that terrified him. On the bridge, his officers scrambled to regain control, but it was useless. The human fleet had overwhelmed their defenses too quickly, too efficiently. It was almost as if they had anticipated every move the Velfar fleet would make, as if they had studied the Dominion's battle tactics long before this war had even begun. And now, the human flagship was closing in. Kralvex could see it clearly on the view screen, sleek, deadly, and utterly confident in its superiority. Its hull barely had a scratch, while the Velfar ships were in ruins. Then, as if to mock them, a communication request appeared on the screen. The humans were reaching out. Kralvex hesitated for a moment. Were they offering terms of surrender? Were they going to gloat over their victory? Either way, he needed to hear it. He needed to understand how this had happened, how his fleet, one of the most feared forces in the galaxy, had been reduced to wreckage. "Open the channel," he growled. The screen flickered, and the human captain appeared. He was young, far younger than Kralvex had expected. His uniform was crisp, unblemished, almost as if he had never been in a real battle before. But his eyes told a different story. There was no arrogance in them, no smug superiority. Instead, there was something far worse: confidence. And then the captain smirked. It was a small thing, just the corner of his lips curling up slightly. But to Kralvex, it sent a chill down his spine. "Admiral Kralvex," the human captain said, his voice calm, measured. "You must be wondering how we knew." Kralvex's claws dug into his armrests. Knew what? The human leaned forward slightly, that infuriating smirk still on his face. "Knew that you were coming. Knew exactly how you'd fight. Knew every maneuver you'd attempt before you even gave the order." He tilted his head, as if studying the Velfar admiral. "Tell me, Admiral, have you ever fought an enemy who learns?" Kralvex's mind raced. What was he talking about? The Dominion had fought countless battles across the galaxy, crushing any opposition that stood in its way. No species had ever truly been a threat to them. No one had ever fought like this. "What are you saying?" Kralvex growled. The human's smirk widened. "I'm saying, we've seen your kind before. Not the Velfar specifically, but empires like yours. Conquerors, warlords, you all make the same mistakes." Kralvex's fists clenched. Mistakes. The human leaned back in his chair, perfectly at ease. "You rely on fear, on overwhelming force. You expect your enemies to break the moment they see your fleets." He gestured toward the battlefield behind him, where Velfar ships were still burning. "But what happens when your enemy doesn't run? What happens when they study you? When they break down your tactics, your weaknesses, when they adapt?" Kralvex felt something he had not felt in decades: doubt. The Dominion had always fought the same way: overwhelming firepower, brutal precision, crushing their enemies before they had a chance to fight back. And it had worked. For centuries, it had worked. But now, for the first time, they had met an enemy that had not only survived their tactics, but had turned them against them. "We've been watching you for a long time, Admiral," The human captain continued. Every battle you've fought, every war you've won. It's all recorded, all analyzed. Your strengths, your weaknesses. He spread his hands. So when you came for us, we were ready. Kralvex's breathing was heavy. His mind raced, trying to find some way to salvage this situation. His fleet was crippled. His forces were scattered. And the humans, they weren't just fighting to win. They were hunting them. The human captain's smirk faded slightly, replaced with something far colder. "This is where it ends, Admiral," he said softly. A cold dread settled in Kralvex's stomach. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. The human didn't need to say it, but the message was clear. This was not just a battle. This was the fall of the Velthar Dominion. The humans had not just defeated them. They had ended them. And they had done it with a smirk. Admiral Kralvex sat frozen in his command chair, his mind struggling to comprehend the full weight of what had just been said. The human captain's smirk had vanished, but its ghost still haunted Kralvex's thoughts. How could they have been so blind? How could they have miscalculated this badly? The Velthar Dominion had fought hundreds of wars, had crushed countless species beneath their might, had turned entire civilizations to dust before they could even begin to resist. Their military doctrine was absolute. Strike hard, strike fast, and obliterate any potential threat before it had time to grow. It had always worked. Until now. The human captain sat back in his chair, his eyes calm, almost patient. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't gloating. That was what terrified Kralvex the most. This human did not consider himself lucky or victorious by chance. No, this was a man who had known, from the moment this battle began, exactly how it would end. The Admiral swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "You said you knew we were coming. That you studied us. How? The Dominion is cautious. We don't reveal our strategies to the galaxy. We wipe out threats before they can even recognize us as an enemy." The human's lips curled slightly, not quite a smirk this time, but something close. "You think you've been unseen," he said, his voice almost amused. "You think your empire has been a secret. Admiral, every fleet you've sent to conquer, every war you've fought, left behind evidence. You believe in wiping out civilizations, but you don't erase the damage you leave behind. And we humans." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "We are very good at reading history." Kralvex stiffened. He had underestimated them. That was clear now. But even so, information alone did not explain this level of precision, this terrifying ability to counter every move his fleet had made. "How did you do it?" Kralvex growled, his claws digging into the armrests of his chair. "Even if you knew how we fight, that doesn't explain how you dismantled my fleet so effortlessly. We have centuries of battle experience. We were winning before you even developed space travel." For the first time, the human smirk returned. "You're right," he said. "You have centuries of experience. But that's the problem, Admiral." His eyes darkened. "You fight like an empire. But we fight like survivors." Kralvex felt his stomach twist at those words. He had always thought of humans as young, as reckless, as primitive. And yet, here they were, standing victorious over what was supposed to be an unstoppable Dominion invasion force. The human continued, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "You fight wars as a matter of expansion. You pick fights with civilizations that can't fight back. You build fleets to intimidate, to subjugate. You rely on numbers, on brute force, on fear." He gestured toward the battlefield outside, where Velthar ships still burned. "But you never learned how to lose. You never had to." Kralvex's breath caught. Humans. They had been on the verge of destruction so many times throughout their history. Wars, disasters, near extinctions, things that would have broken most species, things that should have destroyed them. And yet, they always came back, stronger. This was not just a species that fought. This was a species that refused to die. A sudden alarm blared through the Velfar flagship, snapping Kralvex out of his thoughts. One of his officers turned, his scaled face pale with fear. "Admiral." Multiple explosions detected in the lower decks. Hull breaches across. The officer's voice cut off as the ship lurched. The entire bridge shuddered violently, and Kralvex had to grip his chair to keep from being thrown forward. "What is happening?" he roared. The human captain's voice cut through the chaos, calm and deadly. "The trap was already set, Admiral." Kralvex's eyes widened. He turned to the tactical display, his claws moving rapidly over the controls. His fleet, what remained of it, was in disarray. They had assumed the humans were striking at random, exploiting openings in their formations, but now he saw it. Now he understood. The humans hadn't been attacking randomly. They had been hurting them. Every retreating Velfar ship, every desperate maneuver, every attempt to regroup, it had all been part of a carefully laid plan. And now, as Kralvex watched in horror, the remnants of his fleet had been funneled into a kill zone. A perfect ambush. The human captain tilted his head. "Did you really think we'd just fight you head-on?" Kralvex barely heard him. His mind was screaming. His officers were shouting, scrambling for solutions, but there was no escape, no way out. And then the final blow came. The human captain pressed a single button on his console. "All ships," he said coolly, "fire." For a split second, there was silence. Then the universe exploded. From all sides, human warships unleashed their full firepower. Energy beams sliced through Velfar hulls like paper. Kinetic rounds tore apart engines. Missile barrages turned once mighty warships into debris. The Dominion fleet, one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, was being annihilated in seconds. Kralvex watched in helpless horror as his forces were erased. The bridge shook again. Sparks flew from broken consoles. Another officer screamed as their station burst into flames. His ship was coming apart. And through it all, the human captain remained on the screen, watching. Not with joy, not with cruelty, just certainty. This had never been a battle. It had been an execution. As the Velfar flagship's power failed, as the last remaining ships of the Dominion fleet were reduced to wreckage, Kralvex slumped in his chair. They had walked into a trap from the moment they had entered human space. They had been outmaneuvered, outfought, outmatched. And it had all started with a smirk. Admiral Kralvex's claws trembled as he gripped the edge of his chair. The mighty Velfar Dominion fleet, the unstoppable force that had conquered countless civilizations, was in ruins. His command ship, the Imperator's Wrath, shuddered violently as another explosion tore through its lower decks. Fires raged. The smell of burning metal and charred flesh filled the bridge. "All power to shields." One of his officers screamed, "We need tow." The bridge lurched violently again, and the officer was thrown against the bulkhead. He didn't get back up. Kralvex's heart pounded. His fleet was gone. The humans hadn't just won. They had obliterated his forces. What should have been an easy conquest had become a slaughter. The human captain still sat calmly on the holographic display before him, watching without emotion, not gloating, not mocking, just waiting. It was unbearable. Kralvex bared his fangs, forcing his voice to steady. "You think this is over, human?" His voice was laced with desperation, but he refused to acknowledge it. "The Dominion will not accept this. More fleets will come. More forces will." The human captain sighed. "Admiral, let's stop pretending." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze that sent ice through Kralvex's veins. Pity. "Your Dominion lost this war before it even began." Kralvex snarled. "Lies. We still have." The human gestured, and suddenly, Kralvex's holographic display changed. What he saw made his blood freeze. It was a real-time view of the Velfar homeworld. His homeworld. And it was under attack. Not by some distant rebel faction, not by pirates, but by human forces. How? Kralvex gasped. That's impossible. We would have detected. They arrived while you were distracted, the human said simply. While your fleets focused on Earth, while you marched into what you thought was a simple invasion, we were already moving against you. You assumed we'd be defensive, that we'd cower and react to your attacks. But humans, he gave a small, knowing smile. We don't just defend, we strike back. The feed zoomed in. Velfar warships burned in the skies over their homeworld. Human vessels, sleek and deadly, weaved through the chaos, targeting key installations. Massive detonations erupted across the planetary defense grid. We learned from history, the human continued. When you fight a force stronger than you, don't fight where they expect you to fight. Strike them where it hurts. Kralvex's mind was spinning. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. The Dominion was the greatest power in the galaxy. They had crushed empires that had dared to stand against them. They had never lost. And yet, the truth was undeniable. The mighty Velfar Dominion, with all its fleets, its armies, its conquests, was being undone. And it had all started with a single human captain. The bridge shook again. Consoles flickered. Another explosion roared through the ship. Kralvex gritted his teeth. He had spent his life believing in the Dominion's superiority, in their inevitable victory over all lesser species. He had mocked the humans when he first learned of them. Now those same humans were bringing his empire to its knees. A desperate thought gripped his mind. He had to escape. If the Dominion was to survive, someone had to return and warn the High Council. Someone had to make sense of this disaster, to understand how these humans had managed to turn the tide. If he died here, then everything would be lost. His claws slammed down on the emergency override controls. "Prepare the jump drive," he ordered, his voice sharp. "We are retreating." His officers hesitated. One of them, a young tactician, his scales burned from the fires raging across the bridge, stared at him in disbelief. "Admiral, retreat." Kralvex bared his fangs. "Do it." A flicker of movement drew his attention back to the holographic display. The human captain's gaze had sharpened. "You're trying to run," the human said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. Kralvex sneered. "You can't stop me." The human captain didn't move, didn't react. He simply said 3 words. "Are you sure?" Before Kralvex could respond, his ship's alarm blared. A warning flashed across his tactical display. "Jump drive interference detected. System lockdown engage." "What?" Kralvex's claws flew across the console, but nothing responded. The jump drive, the only way to escape, was completely disabled. Panic surged in his chest. "What have you done?" The human finally leaned back in his chair, watching with quiet satisfaction. "We planned for this." Kralvex's breath came in sharp gasps. They had thought of everything. This wasn't just a battle. It wasn't just a war. It was a trap, from the very beginning. And now, the great admiral of the Velfar Dominion was caught. The bridge continued to shudder as the ship took more damage. The walls groaned. Sparks burst from the consoles. Kralvex stared at the human, his mind reeling. He had always believed that the Dominion was superior, that they were invincible. But now, as his fleet lay in ruins, as his homeworld burned, as his own escape was cut off, he finally understood. The humans had never been the prey. They had been the hunters all along. Admiral Kralvex's breath was ragged. His mind raced, trying to process the horror unfolding before him. His fleet was gone. His homeworld was under attack. His escape was cut off. This couldn't be happening. The bridge of Imperator's wrath was a wreck. Fires raging, alarms screaming. Bodies of his officers slumped over shattered consoles. The Dominion's greatest warship, the pride of their armada, was dying. And the human captain was still watching. Calm, silent, waiting. Kralvex's claws curled into fists. No, I refuse to die like this. He turned to his remaining officers, those still alive, still standing despite their injuries. Prepare all remaining weapons, he growled. If we are to fall, we will take as many of them with us as we can. One of his bridge officers hesitated, looking at the flickering tactical display. Admiral, we have nothing left. Kralvex's eyes narrowed. What? The main cannon is destroyed, the officer said grimly. Missile bays are offline. Our fighters, there are none left. He swallowed. We are defenseless. Kralvex's stomach twisted. This was worse than defeat. This was humiliation. His gaze snapped back to the human captain, still seated in his command chair aboard the enemy vessel. Kralvex's voice was hoarse, filled with bitterness. Do you enjoy this, watching your enemy helpless? Is this what humanity has become? The human's expression didn't change. He simply studied Kralvex, as if deciding whether to answer. Then, finally, he spoke. This isn't about cruelty, Admiral. Kralvex bared his fangs. Then what is it about? The human captain leaned forward slightly. It's about survival. Kralvex sneered. Survival? You could have surrendered. We would have spared your world. The human let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You never planned to spare us. Kralvex froze. The human's eyes locked onto him. We intercepted your Dominion War Council's orders, Admiral. The plan wasn't conquest. His voice was steady, filled with quiet fury. It was extermination. Kralvex's throat tightened. You called us a threat, the human continued. You saw what we did to the Xelvari and the Myrthani, two empires that attacked Earth and failed. You feared us, so you decided to wipe us out before we could become strong enough to resist you. The human leaned back in his chair, but you were too late. A cold silence settled over the ruined bridge. Kralvex knew there was no point in denying it. The Dominion had never planned to coexist with humanity. They had seen Earth's potential, its rapid technological advancements, its unpredictable nature, and they had feared what humanity could become. So they had tried to end them before it was too late. But instead, they were the ones who had fallen. Kralvex's claws dug into the armrests of his chair. What now? He asked, his voice bitter. Do you execute me? Parade my death as a warning. The human shook his head. We're not like you. Kralvex let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Spare me your righteousness, human. If the roles were reversed, you would be dead already. The human tilted his head. You're right, he admitted. If the Dominion had won, we wouldn't have been given mercy. That's the difference between us. He exhaled slowly. But you won't live, Admiral. A cold chill ran through Kralvex. The human's voice was calm, almost regretful. Your ship is crippled. Your fleet is destroyed. Your homeworld is defenseless. We don't need to execute you. The screen flickered, showing external views of the Imperator's wrath. Fires spread across its hull. Explosions ruptured the structure. You're already dead. Kralvex felt something he hadn't felt in centuries. Fear. The once mighty admiral of the Dominion, feared across the stars, was powerless. He had no fleet, no weapons, no escape. The Dominion was finished. And the humans, they had won. The Imperator's wrath drifted through space, its once mighty frame now a burning husk. Fires raged across its hull, oxygen venting into the void, leaving behind only silence. Admiral Kralvex could do nothing but watch as his legacy crumbled. The human captain was still on screen, his expression calm, almost indifferent. This is how it ends, Kralvex muttered, his voice hollow. The Dominion, the greatest empire in the galaxy, reduced to nothing. The human captain tilted his head slightly. Empires don't fall because of one battle, Admiral. They fall because they refuse to change. Kralvex let out a bitter laugh. Spare me your wisdom, human. You won because you were ruthless. The human's gaze hardened. No, We won because you underestimated us." The words hit Kralvex like a hammer. For centuries, the Dominion had crushed civilizations beneath its might. They had assumed humanity would be the same, another species to conquer, to break, to rule. But the humans had fought like nothing the Dominion had ever faced. They had adapted, resisted, outwitted their enemy at every turn. And now they had done the unthinkable. They had won. Kralvex's claws dug into the armrests of his chair. His pride refused to let him beg for mercy. If this was the end, he would face it as a warrior. "What now, human?" he asked, his voice steady. "Will you destroy my world? Erase my people like we tried to erase yours?" The human captain's expression didn't change. "No." Kralvex's eyes narrowed. "Lies. You have the power to wipe us out. You will not allow the Dominion to rise again." The human leaned forward slightly. "You're right. We won't let your empire rise again. But we won't commit genocide." His voice was calm but firm. "Your fleets are gone. Your war machine is shattered. Your colonies will hear of this and turn against you." He paused for a moment before continuing. "The Dominion is over, Admiral. Whether your people survive, that's up to them." Kralvex felt his heart clench. This was worse than death. This was humiliation. The Dominion had ruled through fear, through power, through absolute control. Now that control was gone. Without their fleet, without their leadership, their empire would collapse from within. The species they had enslaved, the planets they had conquered, the officers who still lived, all would turn on them. And the humans had ensured it. The war was over, and the Dominion had lost. Kralvex closed his eyes for a long moment. He had spent his life fighting, commanding, ruling. Now there was nothing left to command. When he opened his eyes again, the human was still watching him, waiting. Kralvex let out a slow breath. "Do it." The human captain frowned. "Do what?" "End this." Kralvex's voice was cold. "Destroy my ship. Kill me. Finish what you started." The human studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No." Kralvex bared his fangs. "Coward." The human's lips curled into a smirk. "No," he said again. "Death would be a mercy, Admiral. And you don't deserve it." Kralvex froze. "Live with your failure," the human said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Live knowing that your empire is gone. Live knowing that your people will curse your name. Live knowing that we, the species you thought was weak, brought you to your knees." Kralvex's body tensed. The screen flickered. Then it went black. For the first time in his life, Admiral Kralvex was truly alone. The Imperator's wrath groaned under the stress of its failing systems. Explosions rocked the lower decks. The engines sputtered, barely keeping the ship from drifting into deep space. There would be no rescue. Kralvex sat in his command chair, staring at the void outside his shattered viewport. The Dominion was gone. Humanity had won. And in the end, it was the human captain's smirk that haunted him the most.